My name is Laura, and at 50, I thought I had everything. A comfortable life, a beautiful home in the suburbs of Chicago, a loving husband, and 2 grown children. I worked hard alongside my husband, Steve, to build a life that many would envy. But all of that came crashing down in one single moment, the moment I discovered that Steve had left everything, absolutely everything, to his ex-wife. I had just returned home from a routine checkup at the doctor's office. It was an ordinary Tuesday, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. But when I walked into our living room, I found Steve sitting there, his expression grim, the air thick with tension. It was odd, I thought, since we were usually able to talk about everything. Steve was a man of few words, but the silence now felt different. He wasn't the man I married, a hard-working, silent partner who kept his cards close to his chest, but always put family first. "Laura," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I think we need to talk." I could already tell something was wrong. His eyes didn't meet mine, and his hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he folded a piece of paper in front of him. A lawyer's letter. I could see the envelope, the familiar letterhead of a firm that we had used for legal matters in the past. My heart sank. Steve wasn't one to share his business with me, but this felt different. It felt important. I crossed the room, sat down across from him, and waited. He sighed, the weight of the moment hanging in the air between us. "I don't know how to say this," he started, but I was already dreading whatever words were coming next. "Just say it, Steve. Whatever it is, we can handle it." Steve reached over, sliding the envelope toward me, and for a moment, I felt a pang of fear in the pit of my stomach. He had never been this hesitant, this distant. "I had the will updated a while ago. I didn't want to keep it from you, but," he paused, struggling to continue. I took the envelope from him, my hands shaking now. I knew something wasn't right. I opened it quickly, reading the first few lines. My eyes scanned the words, "Upon my death, the entirety of my estate, including all business holdings, shall be transferred to my ex-wife, Danielle Harper." The words blurred together. I thought I was reading them wrong, but no, the sentence remained the same. Danielle Harper, his ex-wife. He'd left her everything. All of our assets. The business we'd spent years building together. Everything. I looked up at Steve, my face cold. "What the hell is this, Steve?" He lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. "It's the truth, Laura. I didn't know how to tell you." My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt lightheaded, as though the room had started to spin. This couldn't be real. There must have been some kind of mistake. We had been married for nearly 25 years. We had 2 children together, and yet, all this time, Steve had kept the truth from me. Why would he do this? Why would he leave me with nothing? Why her? I asked, my voice trembling. Why not me? Why not our children? Why Danielle? Steve was silent for a moment, as if he didn't know how to explain something that had no explanation. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made some mistakes, Laura. I promised her years ago that I would make things right. I wasn't able to give her everything when we were married, but I promised that when I was in a position to, I would. This was the only way." I stared at him, horrified. "So you're telling me that after everything we've been through, you chose her? After all the work we did to build this life, you gave it all to her?" "I'm sorry, Laura. I never wanted it to come to this. I thought we could keep it between us. I thought it would be the right thing to do. But I guess I was wrong." "Wrong?" I repeated, the word tasting like acid in my mouth. "This isn't just wrong, Steve. This is a betrayal. You've robbed me of everything we built together." I stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. It felt like a bad dream, something I couldn't wake up from. "How could you do this? How could you leave me with nothing?" "Laura, please," Steve pleaded, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you. This is just how things are now. You have to accept it. But I couldn't accept it. I wasn't going to. I had been a faithful wife. I had worked tirelessly beside him, managing the business, raising our children, and now, after all these years, he was telling me that it meant nothing. That all of it, everything, was going to Danielle. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to let my life be defined by a man's broken promises and his need to make amends with a past I wasn't part of. There had to be more to this. There had to be a reason. The days that followed the discovery of the will were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My mind was consumed by the betrayal that Steve had dealt me. I went through the motions, picking up the kids, making dinner, going to work, but all the while, I felt like I was walking through a fog. The life I had built was slowly slipping through my fingers, and I didn't even know how to begin taking control of it again. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words that Steve had spoken. I promised her. It was as if the promise had overshadowed everything that had come before it, the years we spent together, the laughter, the shared dreams, the children we'd raised. Everything. I kept hearing the sound of his voice, apologetic, regretful, but at the same time, resolute. He had made his choice. And there was no going back. But I couldn't let it end like that. I couldn't let Steve's betrayal be the last word in our story. There had to be more to this. I had to find out why Danielle, his ex-wife, was the one to receive everything. Why had he chosen her over me? Why had he kept this secret for so long? The first step was to learn more about her. I knew a little. Steve had been married to Danielle for 7 years, long before we'd met. They didn't talk much about their past, and honestly, I never cared enough to ask. She'd always seemed like a distant memory to me, something Steve had long since buried. But now, that memory had come to life, and I needed to understand it. I started with the basics, the contact information for her. Of course, Steve had never told me where she lived, but I had enough friends in high places. I called in a few favors, reached out to a private investigator, and within a few days, I had an address. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I wasn't prepared for what I uncovered. Danielle lived in a large, expensive house on the outskirts of the city, far more lavish than any of the properties Steve and I had ever owned. The house was situated on a sprawling lot, surrounded by thick hedges and tall gates, giving it an air of exclusivity. It looked like something out of a movie, the kind of house you'd imagine a former model-turned-socialite living in. I drove by it several times, each time a knot tightening in my stomach. What was I even doing? Was I just looking for something, anything, that could explain this madness? Was I looking for a reason to forgive Steve? Or was I looking for something that would make me feel better about what he had done? I knew the answer. I wasn't looking for forgiveness. I wasn't even looking for closure. I was looking for revenge. On the 3rd day of surveillance, I saw her. Danielle. I watched her walk out of the front door, carrying a shopping bag, her expensive heels clicking on the pavement. She was tall, slender, and appeared to be in her early 50s, though it was hard to tell. She was impeccably dressed, as always, too perfect, too polished for someone who hadn't been married to a billionaire for years. I took a deep breath and steeled myself. This was it. The first step in reclaiming my life. I pulled up to the gate, and without thinking, I pressed the buzzer. The voice that answered was smooth, confident, a touch of curiosity. Yes? I'm sorry to bother you, I began, trying to keep my voice steady, but I'm looking for someone. Danielle Harper? There was a brief silence before she responded. Who's asking? I could hear the suspicion in her voice, but I wasn't deterred. I'm Laura. Steve's wife. I braced myself for her reaction. Would she be surprised? Angry? Would she deny everything? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to back down. The moment she heard my name, there was a noticeable shift in her tone. Ah. Laura, she said, almost as if she were tasting the name. What can I do for you? I need to talk to you. About Steve. About the will. The silence stretched on longer than I expected. I wondered if I'd said too much, too soon. But then, she spoke again, her voice surprisingly calm. I'm not sure there's much to discuss. What you're referring to has already been decided. But if you insist, I'll meet you. She gave me an address, a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where people could talk in private, away from the public eye. I knew I couldn't go there alone. I needed someone on my side, someone who could help me navigate what was coming. I called my brother, Robert, who had always been a bit of a bulldog when it came to family matters. I needed his support, and I knew he would give it to me without question. Robert, I said when he picked up, I need you to meet me. There's something I need to do. Of course. What's going on? It's about Steve and Danielle. We need to talk. We met at the cafe later that afternoon. It was a quiet spot, tucked away on a side street, with dim lighting and wooden tables. When Danielle arrived, she didn't look at me right away. She sat down, her posture perfect, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. She didn't appear fazed by the situation, no nervousness, no guilt, nothing that would indicate she was hiding something. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of anger as I looked at her. She was so poised, so unbothered by the fact that she had just inherited everything Steve and I had worked for. I couldn't understand how she could sit there with such ease, knowing the pain she had caused. Well, she said, leaning back in her chair, you wanted to talk. I took a deep breath. Yes. I want to know why. Why did Steve leave you everything? Why did he promise you all of this? Danielle raised an eyebrow, as if the question amused her. Why do you think? She replied smoothly. Steve and I had a long history together. He promised me things when we were married, and when I lost him, I thought I would never get them. But now he's made it right. After all these years, he's finally come through. Her words were cold, almost rehearsed, but they told me something important. Steve had made a promise to her, a promise that had gone unfulfilled during their marriage. And now, in his later years, he was trying to make it right. But what did that mean for me? What did it mean for our family? Why did I have to lose everything to satisfy some promise he made years ago? You didn't deserve this, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. You don't deserve any of it. Danielle's smile was thin, almost pitying. Maybe not. But life isn't always about deserving, Laura. It's about getting what you can. I stood up, my frustration bubbling over. I'm not going to let you get away with this. Danielle's eyes flickered briefly, but she said nothing. I could feel the tension in the air between us, a thick silence that seemed to suffocate everything around us. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I couldn't shake the feeling that Danielle was hiding something much darker than the shiny image she'd portrayed at the cafe. Her words, "It's about getting what you can," stuck in my mind like an ugly refrain. But it was more than that. Much more. It wasn't just about a promise Steve made, it was about control, manipulation, and power, things I never wanted to believe were part of our marriage. But now, I had no choice but to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The cafe meeting didn't give me the answers I needed, but it gave me a sense of direction. Danielle wasn't going to hand over the answers willingly. She was too slick, too practiced in the art of playing the victim. But if she thought I was just going to walk away, she had another thing coming. That night, after I'd returned home, I went straight to the study. It had been months since I last sat at Steve's desk, but I needed to go through everything. I needed to know what I was up against. I started with the files, business contracts, legal documents, and even personal letters from the past. Everything seemed like just paperwork until I found it. There, tucked in a corner of the drawer, was a faded manila folder. It had been sealed shut with a paperclip that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My heart raced as I opened it, and inside, I found a letter. It was from a lawyer, dated almost 20 years ago, right after Steve and Danielle's divorce. The letter was short, but its contents sent a chill down my spine. It was a settlement agreement. The terms were clear: Steve had agreed to provide Danielle with a substantial amount of money every year until his death, and in return, Danielle would relinquish any claim to his estate or business interests. In other words, Steve had promised to keep her financially secure, even though they weren't married anymore. But that wasn't the worst part. What caught my attention was the second part of the letter. It stated that if Steve was ever in a position to pass on his wealth, whether through inheritance, business sale, or otherwise, he had to leave the bulk of it to Danielle. There was a clause in the agreement that bound him to this promise, no matter what happened in the future. The stipulation was clear: if Steve died or became incapacitated, Danielle would inherit everything he had, and if that couldn't be arranged, then it would go to her children. My mind spun. So, this was it. This was why Steve had left everything to Danielle. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why had he agreed to such terms? Why would he promise her everything, even after their marriage ended? I set the letter down, my hands trembling as the weight of it all began to settle in. For years, I had trusted Steve with everything. I believed in the life we built together. I never questioned his motives or his choices. But now, I was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered world, and it felt like everything I knew was a lie. I needed answers, more answers than I could find in this letter alone. The problem was, Steve wasn't around to give them to me. He'd left me with nothing but this mess, and the more I dug, the deeper the hole seemed to get. I thought back to that night, to the moment when I first discovered the will. Steve's face had been pale, his eyes filled with guilt, but he hadn't said much beyond his apology. He hadn't told me everything. He hadn't told me about the settlement, the clause, or the promise he'd made to Danielle. He hadn't told me why it had taken him so long to make good on it. I needed to speak to him, but how? I tried calling him several times, but his phone went straight to voicemail. It wasn't like Steve to disappear without a trace. In fact, he never left the city for more than a couple of days without telling me. This wasn't just a sudden business trip or a momentary lapse. Something was wrong. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called Robert again and asked him to come over. I needed his help, and I wasn't going to wait around any longer for answers to fall into my lap. When he arrived, I didn't waste any time. "We need to go to the lawyer's office," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "I need to know everything Steve did. All the details. This whole thing feels like one big trap." Robert was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. He wasn't sure if this was the right course of action, but when he looked at me, I could tell he understood the urgency in my voice. He nodded. "All right, Laura. Let's go." We made our way to the lawyer's office, an old brick building in the downtown district of Chicago. It was the kind of place that had seen decades of legal battles, and the walls were lined with dark wood paneling and bookshelves crammed with legal texts. Inside, the receptionist, a young woman with a stern face, gave us an odd look when we asked to see Mr. Jennings, Steve's lawyer. She said he was unavailable, but after a few moments of back and forth, she relented and brought us into his office. Mr. Jennings was an older man, with glasses perched on the end of his nose and a permanent air of exhaustion about him. He was surprised to see us, especially since Steve hadn't mentioned anything about involving me in the legal matters concerning his estate. I could see the discomfort in his eyes as he sifted through his files, searching for the information I was requesting. "You know, Mrs. Harper," he began, his tone careful, "your husband, Steve, he was a man of his word. He did everything according to the letter of the law." I felt my jaw tighten. "Don't give me that. He didn't give me a chance to do anything according to the law. I'm the one left with nothing. You don't think I deserve some answers?" Mr. Jennings sighed, clearly trying to maintain professionalism. "I understand your frustration. I do. But I'm afraid that Steve made a series of choices in his later years that were difficult. This will, for example, it wasn't an easy decision for him. He had to fulfill a promise, a very old promise, and he didn't take it lightly." I shook my head, desperate now. What promise? Why was Danielle so important to him? Why didn't he tell me about this? He made the promise years ago, during their divorce settlement. It wasn't just about her, it was about keeping peace. And it was bound by contract. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to digest everything he was saying. You mean to tell me that he was legally obligated to give her everything? It wasn't as simple as that, Mr. Jennings replied, leaning back in his chair. He was bound by a legal contract that was put in place after their divorce. I can't go into all the details, but I will tell you this: Steve didn't want to hurt you. He cared deeply for you, but his obligations to Danielle were his first priority. My head was spinning. His obligations? His first priority? The words hit me like a slap in the face. So, his family didn't matter? His children didn't matter? I didn't matter? It wasn't about that, Mrs. Harper, Mr. Jennings said softly, his voice almost apologetic. He loved you both, but the promise he made to her, he couldn't break it. I felt my world crumbling around me. And what now? What happens to me? What happens to our children? I'm afraid that's something you'll have to figure out, Mrs. Harper. There are legal routes you can take, but it's a complicated situation. I left his office feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't just fighting for the money anymore, I was fighting for my place in this twisted narrative that Steve had left me in. But I wasn't going to stop. Not now. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. Every time I thought I was getting closer to the truth, another door slammed shut. I was starting to feel like I was chasing shadows, piecing together fragments of a life I thought I understood, only to realize that I never knew the man I had been married to for so long. Steve's promises, his actions, his choices, they had all been part of a carefully crafted illusion that I had bought into, and now I was left with nothing but the wreckage of my own trust. But the investigation wasn't over. I couldn't give up, not when I was so close to understanding what had driven Steve to leave me with nothing. I had already uncovered the legal documents, the promises he had made to Danielle, and the way his past had been woven into the fabric of our life together. But what was the driving force behind those promises? Why did he go so far to ensure she had everything? The answer, I knew, lay somewhere deeper. And as I continued to dig, the truth came to light in a way I hadn't expected. It started with a phone call from Robert, my brother. I had been spending days holed up in the house, going through Steve's old files and documents, trying to find any shred of evidence that might explain his strange behavior in his final years. The will, the settlement agreement with Danielle, the unexplained absences, I had put it all together, but there were still gaps. And I was determined to fill them, no matter what it took. Laura, I found something, Robert said, his voice tight, almost anxious. I'm not sure if this will help, but it's worth looking at. What is it? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the urgency in my chest. There's a storage unit. It's a place Steve rented for years. I think it might have something to do with this, with Danielle. It could be connected to the promise he made to her. I've got the key. A storage unit. I was instantly intrigued. Why would Steve have kept a storage unit for so long, and why hadn't he ever told me about it? He had always been private, but this was different. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. If Robert had found something, it could be the key to understanding everything. I'll meet you there, I said, my voice shaking with anticipation. We need to see what's inside. I met Robert at the unit later that afternoon. The place was tucked away in a quiet industrial area, far from the bustle of the city. It wasn't much to look at, just a plain, metal building with row after row of storage units, all lined up in neat rows. The air inside smelled musty, and the floor was covered with dust, but I could see the lock on the unit Robert had opened. He led me down a narrow aisle, and when we reached the door, he slid the key into the lock, and the door creaked open. The first thing that struck me was the sheer number of boxes. They were piled high, stacked haphazardly as if someone had thrown them there in a hurry. But as I looked closer, something caught my eye, something that made my heart stop. At the back of the unit, on a dusty shelf, was a large, leather-bound photo album. The kind you don't see much anymore, thick pages, the kind that hold old photographs, mementos, and memories. Robert must have noticed the look on my face because he walked over to the shelf and pulled the album down without a word. I took it from him, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. There were pictures of Steve and Danielle, lots of pictures. Photos of their wedding day, of family vacations, of moments that had been frozen in time. They looked so happy together, so in love. But the one thing that stood out more than anything else was the date on the back of each photo. The album spanned decades, with photos that had been taken long after their divorce. I turned the page, and my heart sank. There, in black and white, was a photo of Steve and Danielle, standing together in front of a large, old building. I recognized it immediately. It was the same building that housed Steve's company, the one I had worked in, the one I had helped him build. But this photo wasn't from the 1980s or even the 1990s. It was from just 5 years ago. It was then that I realized something I hadn't considered before. Steve had never truly cut ties with Danielle. He hadn't just made a promise to her that he later fulfilled, he had kept her close, kept her involved in everything. The business, the money, the property, everything we had built was always hers too. Steve hadn't just been fulfilling a promise, he had been carrying out some twisted form of obligation to her. She had always been part of the picture, even when I had no idea. I quickly turned the pages, and my suspicions were confirmed. There were more recent photos, pictures of Steve, Danielle, and another man. A man I didn't recognize, but the way Steve and Danielle were standing with him was telling. They were too familiar with each other, too comfortable. I felt a surge of anger. What was going on? Who was this man, and why was he with them? I pointed to the picture. Who is this? I demanded. Robert squinted at the photo. I don't know. I've never seen him before. But I've got a feeling he's important. Important? My blood ran cold. What was Steve hiding? Why had he kept this man in his life all these years? We spent hours going through the boxes, searching for any more clues, but it wasn't until we found the final box that everything clicked into place. Inside, there was a set of documents, more contracts, but this time, these weren't related to business. These were personal. They were records of an agreement, one that had been signed by both Steve and Danielle, but also by the mysterious man in the photograph. I skimmed through the documents, the words starting to blur together as I processed what I was reading. The agreement was a joint venture, a business deal that had been made between Steve, Danielle, and the man I didn't recognize. The contract outlined a long-term partnership in which the three of them would share ownership of Steve's company, but the most shocking part was buried in the fine print. It turned out that Steve hadn't just promised Danielle everything, he had promised her his company. All of it. The business that I thought we had built together. The company that had made us both wealthy. He had given her a percentage of ownership that had been kept secret from everyone, even from me. But the most incredible part of the deal was the final clause, which stated that if Steve were ever to die or become incapacitated, the entire business, along with all its assets, would pass into the hands of Danielle and her partner. The partner, it seemed, was the man in the photograph, the same man who had been with them for years, someone Steve had brought into the fold under the guise of a business partner. I felt my stomach drop as I read the last line of the agreement. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. Steve hadn't just promised Danielle everything, he had been using me as a pawn in a game that I hadn't even known existed. Robert, this is it, I whispered, my voice hoarse. This is the final piece of the puzzle. Robert stared at the documents, his expression unreadable. So this man, he's the one who's been pulling the strings all along? I nodded slowly. I think so. I think he's the real reason behind all of this. It all made sense now. Danielle had always been the face, the one Steve had promised everything to, but this man, the one I hadn't recognized, the one Steve had kept hidden, he was the true mastermind behind it all. He was the one who had been working with Steve all these years, manipulating the business, controlling everything from behind the scenes. And now, with Steve out of the picture, it was his time to take control. I stood up, my mind racing. This was far bigger than just an inheritance dispute. This was a conspiracy that had been brewing for years, and I was at the center of it. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. I had the truth, and with it, I could finally fight back. I sat in the dimly lit study, the pile of documents spread out before me like a roadmap of deceit, betrayal, and power. The entire picture had changed. For weeks, I had been looking for answers, hoping that somewhere along the way, I'd find a simple explanation for why Steve had left everything to Danielle. I had tried to make sense of the promises, the legal contracts, the hidden assets, and the strange behavior of Steve over the years. But now, with the discovery of the third man in the photographs, the silent partner in the business deal, I understood it all. It wasn't just about a promise to a past wife. It wasn't just about Steve making good on a lost relationship. This was about greed, power, and the slow, insidious manipulation of everything I had worked for, everything we had built together. It was about a conspiracy that had been in the making for years, and I was just a pawn in a game I didn't know I was playing. The man in the photo, the one I didn't recognize, the man who had been standing next to Steve and Danielle all these years, was someone I needed to confront. He was the missing link, the shadowy figure who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. I needed to know everything about him, who he was, how he had come to be involved with Steve, and what his role was in the business dealings that had stolen everything from me. I didn't waste any time. I found his name in the contract, the name that had been listed as an equal partner in Steve's business dealings. His name was Robert Ashford, a man I had never heard of before. There was no mention of him in any of the conversations I had had with Steve over the years. No signs, no clues that would have tipped me off to his existence. But now, he was my only lead. He was the final piece of the puzzle, and I wasn't going to stop until I had answers. I made a phone call to the private investigator who had helped me track down Danielle's address. Within a few hours, I had an address for Robert Ashford. He lived in a luxurious penthouse downtown, a building that stood high above the city like a fortress. His address wasn't listed in any public records, but the private investigator had managed to dig it up through connections in the business world. It was clear that Robert Ashford had the wealth and power to keep himself hidden. But not from me. The next morning, I stood outside the building, staring up at the imposing glass structure. I felt like I was about to enter a different world, one I didn't belong to. The sleek, modern building was home to some of the wealthiest people in the city. I didn't fit in here. I had never belonged to this world of power and privilege. But today, I wasn't just Laura Harper, Steve's wife. Today, I was someone fighting for her life, for her family, and for her future. I walked into the lobby, my heart pounding in my chest. The concierge gave me a curious look as I approached, but I was prepared. I told him I had an appointment with Robert Ashford, and to my surprise, he didn't question it. The elevator ride was long, far too long, and as the floors ticked up, I felt my nerves tighten. I had no idea how this would go. Was Robert going to deny everything? Would he lie to my face? Or would he finally admit what he had been hiding all these years? The elevator doors opened to a grand foyer, the floors polished marble, the walls adorned with expensive art. It was clear that Robert Ashford was a man of taste, a man who had everything. But now, it wasn't the luxury that mattered, it was the truth. I was met by a woman in her early 40s, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. She introduced herself as Ashford's assistant, and before I could say anything, she led me into a large conference room. The room was flooded with natural light, the panoramic windows showing a breathtaking view of the city below. Robert Ashford was sitting at the head of the table, his back to the window. He looked exactly like I imagined he would, charming, confident, with a presence that commanded attention. "Mrs. Harper," he said smoothly, standing up as I entered. His voice was warm, welcoming, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. It felt rehearsed, as if he was already preparing his defenses. "Mr. Ashford," I replied, my voice steady, though inside, my mind was racing. "We need to talk." He gestured to the chair opposite him, but I didn't sit. I needed to stay in control. "I know what you've been doing," I said bluntly, my voice not betraying the storm of emotion inside me. I know about the business deals. I know about the promises Steve made. And I know that you've been working with him, and with Danielle, all along. Robert's expression didn't change, but I could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes. I'm afraid I don't understand, Mrs. Harper. What exactly are you accusing me of? You've been pulling the strings behind the scenes, I continued, my voice growing firmer. You've been using Steve, using me, and using everything we've built together to get what you want. I know about the settlement agreement, the business contracts, the ownership shares. I know that you're the one behind the scenes, calling the shots. Robert didn't flinch. He remained seated, his hands steepled in front of him, his eyes never leaving mine. You've been busy, haven't you? He said, a small smile playing on his lips. I'm impressed. But you've misunderstood, Mrs. Harper. It's not as simple as you think. What do you mean? I asked, my patience wearing thin. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes calculating. The business, the promises, those were all part of an arrangement. An arrangement that was made long before you came into the picture. Steve and we've been partners for years. What you're seeing now, the inheritance, the will, it's all part of a much bigger plan. One that had to be executed a certain way. And Danielle? She's just the beneficiary, the one who keeps everything in the family. But you're an outsider. I felt a surge of anger at his words, but I didn't let it show. You're telling me I've spent 25 years with Steve, and I'm just an outsider? Robert nodded, his smile widening. Exactly. You were never meant to be part of this. You were a distraction. A pleasant one, for sure, but ultimately a distraction. Steve's real legacy, his real success, those were always going to go to Danielle. And the business? That was mine long before you even knew what was happening. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So this was all planned? All of it? My voice was trembling now, and I had to take a breath to steady myself. You used me. You used my family. And you think you can just walk away from this? Robert's expression softened slightly, but only out of pity. I don't blame you for being upset, Mrs. Harper. But this is business. It's always been business. And you were never part of the plan. I stood up, my fists clenched at my sides. I'm not done yet, Robert. You may think you've won, but I'm not going to let you take everything from me. I'm going to fight you. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done. Robert's face hardened, the smile fading. You can try, he said, his voice low, but the threat was clear. But you're going to lose. This is bigger than you. As I walked out of that penthouse, I realized that Robert Ashford had underestimated me. He thought he could control everything, manipulate everything, but he hadn't counted on one thing, me. I wasn't going to let him destroy my life. Not without a fight. I left Robert Ashford's penthouse feeling like I had just stepped out of a battlefield. His words had cut deeper than I cared to admit, but they also ignited something in me, a fire that hadn't been there before. I had spent so long letting others control my life, letting Steve and his promises dictate my future, that I had forgotten one important thing: I had the power to change my own fate. I wasn't just going to lie down and accept what Robert had done. No, I would fight him. I would fight for my children, for my family's legacy, and for myself. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. Robert had played his hand carefully, and he had all the advantages: power, money, influence. But I had something he didn't, the truth. And I would make sure that everyone knew what he had done. That would be my weapon. The first step was to take everything I had learned and put it into action. I started by reviewing the contract again, the one Steve had signed with Danielle and Robert. It was airtight. There was no doubt that Steve had made his promises, and that legally, he had to follow through with them. But there was one crucial piece of information that had been buried deep within the fine print of the agreement: an escape clause. I hadn't noticed it at first. It was a clause that stated if the partnership between Steve and Robert were ever deemed to be unsustainable, by a court of law, or if there were extenuating circumstances that rendered the business operation unfair to any surviving family members, the ownership would revert to the surviving spouse or legitimate heirs of Steve Harper. That was the loophole. It wasn't a guarantee that I would get everything back, but it gave me a legal foothold. It was enough to open a door, a crack through which I could start to pry loose the control Robert had over the business. I immediately reached out to a lawyer, someone who had experience in corporate law and inheritance cases. A woman named Valerie Lawson, recommended by a trusted friend. Valerie had the kind of sharp mind and legal expertise I needed, someone who wasn't afraid to take on the big players. I needed someone who could help me turn the tables, someone who understood that sometimes the law could be a weapon, not just a set of rules. We met at her office the following day. It was a small, modern space in the heart of downtown, not the flashy, high-rise office of someone who worked for big corporations, but the kind of place where real work got done. Valerie greeted me warmly, but her eyes were already scanning the documents I had brought. As I laid out everything I knew, everything I had uncovered, she listened intently, nodding as she pieced together the puzzle I had laid out for her. "I've worked with people like Robert Ashford before," Valerie said, her voice calm but firm. "Men who think they can get away with anything, just because they have money and power. They think the law is something they can bend to their will. But they're wrong. You have leverage here, Laura. This clause you found, it could be the key." I felt a surge of hope. "You think we can use it?" "I don't just think we can. I know we can," she said. "But we need to move quickly. The longer you wait, the more ground Robert will gain. He'll try to bury this. He'll try to make it go away, and you'll be left with nothing." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do we need to do?" "We start by filing for a restraining order against the transfer of any assets from the business," Valerie said. "We'll claim that the terms of Steve's will were invalid, that his promise to Danielle and Robert was not made under fair terms. We'll argue that their agreement was based on manipulation and that it's damaging to you and your children. Then, we'll work to prove that the business should be turned over to you as Steve's legitimate heir." It sounded like a long shot. But in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for the business anymore. I was fighting for the integrity of my family's name. Fighting for the legacy that Steve and I had built together. Fighting for justice. Valerie and I spent the next few days preparing everything. We filed the necessary paperwork, including a petition to the court, and began preparing for a hearing. The process was slow, but every step forward felt like progress. And I knew I had to keep pushing. But it wasn't just the legal battle that weighed on me. The more I learned, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the business, it was about Steve. About everything I had believed he stood for, everything I thought he had cared about. The man I had married had been hiding secrets from me for years. He had made promises to another woman that had completely changed the course of my life. And now, I had to confront not just Robert Ashford, but Steve's own legacy. As the hearing date approached, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. I spent hours poring over the legal documents, memorizing the details, making sure I knew everything inside and out. But despite my preparation, there was still a part of me that felt unsettled. What if Robert had anticipated this? What if he had already made plans to protect himself? What if he had used his influence to prevent me from winning? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd already taken steps to ensure that Robert couldn't find out what I was doing, but it didn't stop the sense of paranoia that crept into my mind. Robert had too many resources, too many connections, and I knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat up late, my thoughts racing. I kept thinking about the first time I had met Steve, about how we had built our life together. I remembered the early days of our marriage, how we had worked side by side to build something that would last. I thought about the children we had raised, the future we had envisioned. All of that was at risk now. And it wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal. It was the lie that Steve had lived for all these years. I kept asking myself, why hadn't he told me? Why had he kept all of this from me? And why hadn't I seen it coming? But the more I asked myself those questions, the more I realized that I couldn't change the past. All I could do was fight for the future. For me. For my children. For the life I had worked so hard to build. The next morning, as I prepared for the hearing, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The nerves were still there, of course, but they were different now. This wasn't just about the business anymore. This was about reclaiming control over my own life. I wasn't going to let Robert Ashford or anyone else decide my fate. I was going to take back what was rightfully mine, and I was going to make sure everyone knew that I wasn't afraid to fight for it. The courthouse was cold and imposing, the kind of place where you could almost feel the weight of history in the air, where justice had been dispensed for decades, for centuries. But today, it felt like more than just a building where legal battles were fought. Today, it felt like a battlefield, a place where I would finally have a chance to reclaim everything that had been taken from me. The courtroom was quiet as I walked in, the eyes of the people in the gallery following me as I made my way to the front. My lawyer, Valerie, was already there, sitting at the table, her papers neatly stacked before her. I took a deep breath and sat beside her, my hands resting on my lap. I could hear the soft murmur of conversation behind me, but it felt distant, as if I was in a world of my own. My thoughts were consumed by the case, by the fight I was about to face, and the weight of everything that had led me here. On the other side of the room, I spotted Robert Ashford. He was sitting with his lawyer, looking calm, almost smug, as if he believed this was already over. He hadn't seen me coming. He hadn't realized that I would be the one to turn the tables, that I would be the one to expose the lies. But as I looked at him, I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, just a glimmer of uncertainty. He knew this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood. I straightened up, trying to steady my nerves. I had prepared for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, it felt real, too real. But there was no turning back. I couldn't back down now. Not after everything I had uncovered. Not after everything I had been through. The judge took his seat, and we all sat down. He glanced at the documents in front of him, his face neutral. We are here today to hear the case regarding the estate of Stephen Harper and the ownership of his business. Mrs. Harper, your counsel has petitioned the court to invalidate the terms of Mr. Harper's will and the agreement surrounding the transfer of the business to Mr. Ashford and Mrs. Harper's ex-wife, Danielle. Is that correct? Valerie nodded, her expression confident. Yes, Your Honor. We are here today to prove that the will and the agreement signed by Mr. Harper were not made under fair terms and that they were harmful to Mrs. Harper and her children. The judge turned to Robert's side of the room, his gaze settling on him. Mr. Ashford, how do you respond to this petition? Robert stood, his tall frame making him seem even more imposing. He gave a small, almost practiced smile, as if he had rehearsed this moment. Your Honor, we stand by the validity of the will and the agreements in question. Mr. Harper's wishes were clear, and he made them known to both me and his ex-wife, Danielle. These documents were all signed with full knowledge and understanding of the terms. The judge nodded, then turned to Valerie. Mrs. Harper, I understand you have presented new evidence. What is this evidence, and how does it support your claim? I felt a pang of anxiety, but Valerie was calm, poised. She stood and presented the documents we had gathered, the legal filings, the original will, and the crucial escape clause in the settlement agreement. As she spoke, I glanced over at Robert, who was now watching us intently. His smugness had faded, replaced by a flicker of concern. He knew what was coming. The evidence we are presenting today, Valerie said, her voice clear and steady, shows that there were significant irregularities in the way the business was transferred, and that the terms of Mr. Harper's will were influenced by external factors that were not in Mrs. Harper's knowledge at the time of his death. Specifically, the settlement agreement signed by Mr. Harper and Mr. Ashford binds them to promises that were not disclosed to Mrs. Harper, which are detrimental to her rights as a surviving spouse. I watched Robert closely as Valerie continued. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. It was clear that this wasn't going the way he had expected. The more Valerie spoke, the more I could see the walls around Robert starting to crumble. He wasn't the confident man who had looked down on me just weeks ago. Now, he was the one on the defensive. The judge flipped through the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These clauses are significant," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I see that Mrs. Harper was not made aware of the full extent of Mr. Harper's business dealings with Mr. Ashford and Mrs. Harper's ex-wife. This raises serious questions about the fairness of the agreements." Robert stood up suddenly, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, I object. Mrs. Harper has no legal standing to challenge these agreements. They were signed by her husband, and they are legally binding. There is no evidence of coercion or manipulation." Valerie didn't hesitate. "We have evidence, Your Honor, that these agreements were made under duress, and that Mr. Harper was not in a state of mind to make such decisions freely. We also have reason to believe that Mr. Ashford's influence over Mr. Harper was far more significant than Mr. Ashford has let on." Robert's face darkened, his calm demeanor cracking. He shot a glance at his lawyer, but it was too late. The judge was already considering the new evidence. "I will need time to review the evidence and hear further testimony on the matter. We will reconvene in 2 days to proceed with the next phase of this case." With that, the judge dismissed us, and the courtroom buzzed with the sound of murmurs and whispers. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't over yet, but I had just taken the first step in what was going to be a long and difficult journey. The look on Robert's face said it all. He was rattled. He knew the game had changed. As we left the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next phase would be the most difficult, the most intense. I had to stay focused, stay determined, and see this through to the end. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the upper hand. Robert Ashford had underestimated me, and now, it was time for him to pay the price. The days between the first hearing and the rescheduled one felt like an eternity. Every moment was spent in preparation, gathering more documents, piecing together testimonies, and preparing myself for the final confrontation with Robert Ashford. It felt like my entire world had come down to this one moment, this one last battle for everything I had lost. But deep down, I knew I couldn't lose. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to let Robert, or anyone else, take what was mine. The night before the final hearing, I hardly slept. My mind kept racing with questions, doubts, and fears. Was the judge going to rule in my favor? Would he see the truth of what had been done to me, to my children, to the family that Steve and I had built together? I thought about the life I had once had, before all of this started, before the lies and betrayal came crashing into my world. And I thought about what it would mean to take back what was rightfully mine. The business, the house, the future I had worked so hard to build. But more than that, I thought about justice. This wasn't just about money or property, it was about holding Robert accountable for everything he had done. When I walked into the courtroom the next morning, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It wasn't the calm of someone who was certain they would win, it was the calm of someone who knew they had done everything in their power, who had fought with everything they had, and who had uncovered the truth. Whatever happened, I could live with myself. The courtroom was packed. The gallery was full of onlookers, reporters, and even a few familiar faces, friends who had come to support me. I was grateful for their presence, for the strength they gave me just by being there. They had watched me go through the highs and lows of this journey, and now, we were at the final chapter. The judge entered the room, and we all stood. As he took his seat, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Robert sat across from me, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowed in concentration. I could see the tension in his face. He knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about a business deal anymore. It was about power, control, and consequences. The judge addressed the room. "We are here today to make a final determination regarding the estate of Stephen Harper and the validity of the agreement surrounding his business dealings. After reviewing the evidence presented, I have come to a decision." My heart raced. This was it. He turned to Robert. "Mr. Ashford, after careful consideration, I find that the terms of the agreement between you, Mr. Harper, and Mrs. Harper's ex-wife, Danielle, were not made under fair conditions. The evidence shows that Mrs. Harper was not fully informed of the extent of the business dealings and the promises made. Furthermore, it is clear that you had undue influence over Mr. Harper at the time these agreements were signed. Robert's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. Moreover, the judge continued, I find that the clause in the settlement agreement, which allows for the transfer of assets under certain conditions, is valid. However, it is clear that the business and assets were unfairly withheld from Mrs. Harper, who is the surviving spouse and rightful heir of her husband's estate. Robert's eyes widened, and I could see the realization dawning on him. The game was over. He had lost. The judge looked directly at me. Mrs. Harper, the court finds in your favor. The business, assets, and property in question will be returned to you and your children, as outlined in the terms of your husband's will and the legal agreements. Mr. Ashford would advise you to review the legal implications of your actions, as there will be consequences for the fraudulent and manipulative nature of the deals you were involved in. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the gallery erupted into quiet murmurs of approval. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, so overwhelming that it nearly brought me to my knees. I had done it. I had won. Robert sat there, motionless, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. He had always believed that he could control everything, everyone, but now, it was clear that his grip had slipped. He had underestimated me, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The judge gave a final nod. This case is dismissed. Mrs. Harper, the court will provide you with the necessary documents to initiate the transfer of the assets and business ownership. I expect this matter to be concluded promptly. I stood up, my legs shaky but strong. Valerie was beside me, her expression a mix of satisfaction and professional pride. You did it, she said, her voice soft but full of conviction. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the heartache, felt like it was finally being lifted. I could see my future again. I could see a way forward. And it was brighter than I had imagined. As I walked out of the courtroom, I couldn't help but glance at Robert one last time. He was sitting there, his face contorted in frustration and disbelief. But I didn't feel any satisfaction in his failure. I didn't need that. What mattered was that I had stood up for myself, for my children, and for the life that Steve and I had built together. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my power. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly. It felt like a new day had begun. As I walked toward my car, I saw my children waiting for me. Their faces lit up when they saw me, and I couldn't help but smile. They had been through so much, and now, we could finally begin to heal. As we drove home, I thought about what had happened over the past few months. The battles, the tears, the sleepless nights. And I thought about how much I had learned about myself along the way. I had discovered a strength I never knew I had. And while the past would always be a part of me, I knew I was ready to move forward. It wasn't just about the money or the business. It was about taking control of my own story, reclaiming my life, and finding peace. And in that moment, I knew I had won. The world may be full of people like Robert Ashford, people who think they can manipulate others for their own gain, but in the end, the truth has a way of coming to light. And no one can escape the consequences forever. Author's note. This story explores the themes of betrayal, resilience, and justice. Laura's journey is one of reclaiming her power, not just through legal means, but through a personal awakening. The story reminds us that even when we feel powerless, the truth has the power to change everything.